Hello, greetings and welcome, my dear listeners. My name is Heretical Hatter, and I welcome you to the 7th episode of my little series, The Tau Empire Reimagined. I must say that the speed of my work on this project isn't as fast as I hoped, but not as slow as I feared. Also, I made a little poll in the meantime between the episodes and asked you how long, in your opinion, the episodes should be. And most of you said, well, not that many of you voted, between 1 hour and 1.5 hours. So I will try to keep this length of videos, at least for a time being. I should also apologize to Mark's Emo for badly pronouncing his name, because I keep calling him Markismo, and he told me that it should be Mark's Emo. So, sorry mate, it's hard to know how exactly to pronounce a name. I was going more with Italian-French pronunciation rather than German, with X. But yeah, not really much to announce in this episode. Well, outside that, I shall start uni again in this week, so it will be harder to work, but on the other side, it's not really that much work on uni right now. To be more precise, I can tell you that the amount of time I will be spending on university, is basically cut in half compared to my previous years. Honestly, I am still shocked how much free time I have. Just imagine if you were basically going back to a routine you are used to, but you are spending just half amount of time for the same thing. So yeah, a pleasant change, I'm not gonna lie. I am so happy that I will be able to go to uni and continue my creative work, not only on this series, but my other works. It's really liberating. Like, this ability to create, to be creative, to create for you, and I'm not gonna lie, for myself, it sets me free. I'm not going to lie. This is really pleasant. I apologize, I'm mumbling again. Well, I guess I shouldn't be stalling anymore. Let's see what we have in store for today. So, in the last episode, something important happened. I wonder how many of you missed it. Because last episode, we arrived to the very end of the 38th millennium of the 40k galaxy. So yeah, from now on we'll be talking about 39th millennium. A long way is still before us, before we enter the age of Damocles' Gulf Crusade and the modern era of 40k, but we are getting there, slowly but surely. From perspective of the Tau calendar, or well, Age of Unity calendar, the 39th millennium is between 3795 era of Unity and 5023. And oh boy, this millennium is busy. I mean comparable to the last age, a lot of shit happened. This age is not only marked by an impressive scale in colonization, but also amount of war and suffering which the coalition experienced. In many ways, this millennium will be a wake-up call for the Tau. I believe I said it before, but the idea that Tau are so incredibly naive as it is portrayed in the canon is fun, but only to a point. After all, they interacted with dangerous species and races which couldn't be convinced to join the greater good in the past. Yet this fact is forgotten by the writers of Black Library quite a lot. This age, this part of my project, will rectify the scale of naivety of a Tau as a species and coalition, so a faction which replaces the Tau Empire in my project. And it's no wonder, because the third sphere of expansion is one of most brutal ages in the history of the Tau and the coalition at large. The third sphere of expansion, a very ambitious project from the perspective of coalition and ethereals at large. It lasted from year 18 M39 to the very start of the 40th millennium. From perspective of Tau calendar, it lasted between 3817 to 5023 Age of Unity. So, an expansion that lasted 982 Terran years, or 1206 Tau years. It would be the longest expansion of all, but also not as successful as many hoped. The Ethereals kept this expansion going for far longer than it had any right to be. They wanted to play it off as a golden age that never ends, but it turned out to be the age of war, which they just couldn't accept, so they kept prolonging the expansion, the date when it should end, just to end on a positive note of total victory and golden age. The third sphere of expansion began 22 years, Tau years, after the official end of second sphere of expansion. It was a little pause to get everything prepared, to upgrade the vehicles, prepare new colonization vessels, new expansion vessels and exploration vessels, just to get everything ready. With amount of production that Coalition could put out, 22 years was quite a lot of time. Unfortunately for plans of Ethereals and Coalition at large, the start of expansion was slower than expected, mostly because of interactions with anomalies which were more prevalent in this region of space, so navigation was harder. The Nikasar were very important, but still expansion wasn't as quick as many had hoped. Still, it was rather successful. After 128 years since the expansion started, only 3 new sept worlds were established, with 21 worlds altogether being created in this era. So, from calendar perspective, every 6 Tau years, a new colony. Not bad. Still, it was slower than expected. The anomalies really made everything more difficult. Even with the second generation of Ether Drive, moving great amount of people was still slow, and colonization proven to be more difficult in this region of space. The sept worlds established were 3, as I said. First one was T-Raos, and this one is situated near one of the bigger anomalies in the region, known as the Frozen Storm and the Perdus Rift. This sept was mostly established as navigational sept and research sept. So, with all the equipment within this sept, they could help navigation of all fleets in the region. It was still hard and difficult, but workable. Especially because both anomalies were not only, nebulas or wandering stars or planets or strange debris fields, but they were also influenced by Imperium, by the warp. Yes, those anomalies were, they weren't warp storms, but their energy was so strange that it affected not only real space, but the warp space as well, which proven to be quite dangerous region to navigate, unless you had really, really good maps, and well updated maps. T-Raos was essential for keeping those maps in this region, updated. Due to developments in research of those anomalous regions of space, this was also the sept where the first official coalition Psyker school was established. In the ages past, the Psykers of all species that had psychic potential were taught by a moving school. Both Nikasar and Domati, who were the first psychic species and the most powerful psychic species of the coalition, were moving on ships in fleets that kept on gathering and detecting psychers of different species, including humans, gathering them, teaching them and distributing them when they were deemed safe in different regions of the coalition as they were needed. However, with growing population of the coalition, some schools were established on both Domati and Nikasar homeworlds. The Ethereals, of course, weren't so happy that the Psykers were not exactly under their control or close to where they could observe them very closely. So they created, founded a psychic school, which one was, still run by Domati and Nikasar mostly, as Tau still had no bloody idea how psychic power works, but now Ethereals had easier time keeping an eye on them. So yeah, T-Raos, the first coalition psychic school. One which would be proven quite essential and important in the future ages. The next sept world is Xe-Ilia. It was an industrial sept world. It was designed to be a supply hub for the third sphere of expansion, or the southern direction of a third sphere. what wasn't known to the coalition at large at the time of the colonization, that long ago this system had a primitive sapient species, one which was wiped out by Mechanicus' exploration fleet. This system had numerous moons which are just rich with resources. I mean, some moons were more metal than rock. They were incredibly dense and were full of precious materials. It had also two very verdant worlds which would be easily colonized by humans, and one world which could be easily transformed into a forge world. In fact, Xelia was planned to be a heart of the sector, which was to be established in this region of space. One verdant world was to be transformed into an agri-world. The second was to be slowly transformed into a hive world. And a planet which had a lot of resources was to be transformed into a forge world. With all the resource-rich moons in the system, it would mean that this system could not only arm and produce enough weapons to arm an army, had enough population to pull out a shit ton of regiments, and had a world which could feed both the hive world and the forge world. Xelia was to be a capital of the entire imperial sector. Of course, with massive warp storm cutting the entire sector off, this was not to be. The Xelia was about to be transformed into one of the greatest manufacturing sept worlds of a coalition. Because, my dear listener, I'm quite hopeful that if you know anything about Tau, is that one of their most important characteristics is that they are efficient. They can both create a very efficient in terms of manufacturing world while keeping it, safe to live in. And the coalition transformed this system into a literal hub of industry. The Earth castes quite literally started to just carve out the moons that were full of those resources and transform their insides into massive production hubs. The resource-rich world which was to be transformed into a forge world was terraformed to be livable. So not only there were free worlds with quite impressive population, but they had literally moons that they were hollowing out to build massive factories within. And to those who think that this description is over the top, I propose that you check the information about worlds in Farsight enclaves, because Farsight enclaves do have examples of Earthcast hollowing out quite significant portions of planets. And this is possible in enclaves, which are significantly smaller to the Tau Empire. So keep it in mind when I'm telling you that not only Xelia was an impressive world in terms of population, but also in terms of production, in some ways exceeding the expectations the human Imperium of Man had for this system. And the last sept world established in this initial era of expansion was Real. Real in many ways mirrored the Xelia as industrial world, but it wasn't as industrial. In many ways, it was seen as a fleet world. This region of space was quite open. As you can see on the map, this region of space allowed to expand both north, northwest, northeast, and east, basically in almost every direction for the future of the third sphere of expansion. It was also relatively open region of space in terms of amount of anomalies, so it was hoped that because of smaller amount of anomalies, this subworld will become a shipyard for all future expansions in this direction of space. Things didn't exactly go as planned, as next discoveries and established contact would force the coalition to focus their resources in different regions of space and put the expansion in that direction on hold for quite some time. Third sphere of expansion is chugging along just fine. I mean, it isn't as fast as many people hoped, but hey, we can't have everything. And then, suddenly, and without warning, the coalition encounters a quite big faction in 122 M39, or 3944 Age of Unity. They encounter the Osten-C Council. No, I'm not going to lie. The canon has basically no information about it. Like, literally there is nothing, only that it was an alliance of few xenos that were, well, taken in by the Tau Empire. So I basically made everything up about them, because there is literally nothing, like in most of the Tau lore, sadly. Like, this is a good example why this project isn't bad idea, because there is so much lore in the Tau Empire history that is not expanded, not developed, not even mentioned that much. And on the Osten-C Council is one of them. Like, we have no information of them. So I had to be a little creative. Osten-C Council was an alliance of 9 different species united in their desire to survive in this dangerous galaxy. They had quite unpleasant encounter with a bit evil Beastman faction, which forced them to unite and wipe this faction out, which wouldn't be known for quite some time. Those Beastmen were corrupted by chaos. But Osten-C Council, being united, managed to beat the ever-loving shit out of them. What is interesting, however, is that Osten-C Council wasn't merely a military or economic alliance. It was a religious alliance. Sounds sketchy, doesn't it? A religious alliance manages to win against a chaos incursion. I mean, chaos corrupted faction. Like, even beastmen, who are not that high on the list of dangers in this galaxy, still, touch of chaos is quite impressive. And it does enjoys to corrupt religions of different types. But here, this didn't seem to be a case. The Ostenancy Council believed in two-faced God, or a twin God. God of flesh and machine, of mind and spirit. A faith that, exploring the reaches of your own abilities and of technology, and seeking out the truth of reality, is very important, and keeping balance between flesh and metal. This religion encouraged to modify yourself with cybernetic enhancements, but also keeping it balanced with your own flesh. What might surprise some of you, the council wasn't fearful of psychers. Quite the opposite. They saw that the twin god could bring peace and stability to a psyker, and if anything went wrong and they were transformed in some way, this imperfection, this corruption could be cut off and exchanged for more pure machine. As you probably could guess, this religion, or this set of beliefs, seems like interesting mix of machine cult and beliefs of Iron Warriors. Sadly, the knowledge of two-faced God or the twin God is limited in modern era. As far as some scholars know, it could be one of the minor warp gods. Maybe it was connected to chaos, probably not. It's hard to tell. From perspective of the newest lore, as far as we know, the two-faced god or the twin god is somehow connected to Vashtor, maybe. But on the other hand, this faith that Ostenancy Council kept doesn't seem to be chaos related. In fact, it seems to be staving off chaos. So maybe because of beliefs of those xenos, some part of faith of Mechanicus and other factions in the Imperium of Man created a minor deity of order, similar to the God Emperor and the Goddess of the Tau, who kept them safe for some time? It's really hard to tell. I want to keep it vague, but explore the concept that it is possible for a minor warp deity to survive and keep their, faithful safe for some time. In terms of scale of power, the council was significantly, weaker compared to the coalition. The coalition had 15 members and 170 worlds by the time they met. The council, on the other hand, had only 9 races and 54 worlds. Around 1/3 of the number of worlds under control of coalition. Some of you might think that with 3-to-1 advantage in number of worlds on the side of coalition, the coalition is a certain winner in any engagement, in any rivalization between those two factions. Sadly, it's not so easy. First of all, both factions were more about diplomatic approach. Both sides, first and foremost, wanted to take over other factions in the name of, growing in power and limiting the amount of resources they would spend expanding their own territories. and growing their power. So the Council tried to convert the entire coalition into belief, into the two-faced god. And the same way, coalition attempted to convert the Council into following the philosophy of the greater good. What is funny, that both factions found their match, and their efforts were cancelling each other out. And so you might think, well, the diplomatic way didn't work out, so it's time for war. Not exactly. Because in war, having a number advantage isn't really that big of advantage. You must think about logistics, about the speed of vessels, about the skill of military. And the Council had really good military. They also had warp engines and psychic choirs to communicate faster than light. So, the Council had still smaller military and smaller navy, but their army was really good, like easily comparable with the coalition army. They had much faster and strong and competent navy, and a way to communicate between stars faster than light, something that the Council didn't have. And you might think, well, so the Council has advantage. No, because coalition had far greater in terms of numbers navy and army. They had much better defenses, and in many ways some of their military technology was superior to that of the Council. And thanks to their research on the warped engines, they knew how to detect them in transit. The advantages of both sides were cancelling each other out yet again. Both professional armies, but one was a little bit slower, but had significant number advantage over the other side, and knew how to detect their movement. The other side was much faster and had much easier time to send communication through the void of space, but again, they could be detected, and, what I didn't mention before, ways of travel and communication of the Council were far less reliable comparable to those of the Coalition. In other words, both factions were keeping each other in check. As you could probably guess, this caused some tensions between two factions and small conflict which, well, transformed into a Cold War between the Council and the Coalition. Now to a fun part. Something which you probably notice I didn't say anything about. What exact races were members of the Council? And most importantly, who was the founding member of the Council? After all, there had to be someone with impressive diplomatic ability and charisma to spread their faith to numerous races of their alliance and unite them in the war which solidified their faction. I had a list of few species, but for the sake of keeping this series and this video chugging along and just going forward, I decided to speak of only one. A race that I didn't create, but one that doesn't come from other author that I asked for permission. I decided to be helpful to the Games Workshop and recycle a species which really was, well, forgotten by Games Workshops for some time. They have no right to be where they are right now, and they should have their own place among the stars, and I think that this place is just perfect. Ladies, gentlemen, and that one lizard person, you know who you are? Let me introduce you to Zoats, a race of diplomats for Tyranids. Good lord, old 40k lore is wacky as fuck. I mean, really, diplomats for Tyranids. I think that diplomats for Tyranids kinda destroy the whole point of Tyranids, of being this massive, ever-hungry organism that you can't communicate with, that just eats and consumes you whole. But no, for some reason the Games Workshop just kept Zoats somewhere in the background, somewhere hidden as this strange xeno, centaur, lizard people who have some kind of relationship with the Tyranid hive mind, that they control them, or that they are controlled by the hive mind and used to just mess around with different species in the galaxy and make Tyranid fleet's arrival just easier. But that doesn't make any sense, it just doesn't add up with Tyranid lore. And I'll be honest with you, it's just really fucking dumb. So I decided that, hey, recycling is good, it's good for a planet, and it's good for stories. And as I said before, I will be fucked if I have to come up with new species every time I find new faction, so recycling. Because fuck my life, I am not figuring out every single race that would be part of a coalition. I will let other people come up with new ones. So, Zoats. 6-limb, massive, muscular lizard centaur people. An ancient race, and I think that we can even go as far to put them as a race which was created by the Old Ones. And hell, they even fit quite well with the Old Ones' lore. They are wacky looking, they are lizard people, they are strong physically, they are psychic in some lore, and they do use quite a lot of interesting technology. They almost seem like a strange mix of the Eldar, the Orcs, and the Jaquero, which is just perfect for me. So I made Zoats into the Old One's creation, a failed creation, and a small portion of their population managed to survive the war in heaven and hid in this region of space. They aren't as powerful as during the war in heaven, they lost vast majority of their technology, so like vast majority of the Old One's creations, they are just a shadow of their former selves. But hey, I think that making Zoats an Old One's race that managed to survive the war in heaven, and now millennia, well, millions of years later, they starting to create their own little empire, and they meet this growing power of the Tau and the coalition at large, might be interesting part of the coalition lore. But hey, they do have members or survivors of a war in heaven as part of their faction, which is, a neat bit of the lore. And this also connects to the concept of the two-faced god or the twin god, because, as we will know, the Old Ones are most likely somehow connected to the Eldar pantheon. Maybe they were Eldar who were brought up to the god status, or maybe they were old weapons of the Old Ones that managed to gain sentience and survive the war in heaven. And I think that the two-faced god might be something similar. Maybe it is like a byproduct of the Old One's creation, similar to the Gork and Mork. Just a side effect of Old One's work that remained long after they were gone. Part of the Zoats moved to this region of space. They were hiding and were hoping to, grow in population and simply survive. But with their psychic potential, they felt incoming danger, and they used their diplomatic abilities to unite neighboring species, unite against this aggressive, chaos-corrupted beastmen, which would be obviously their enemies, as with their knowledge of ancient times, or at least fragments of its history, they would know how to, detect chaos corruption and fight against it. Maybe that's part why the religion or faith expanded with this cybernetic part to be even more, protecting their own bodies by cutting off any chaos corruption or warp corruption by literally cutting off parts of their body. And they succeeded. They managed to create the Ostency Council and starting to build up their power. They figured out that simply surviving, simply hiding wasn't enough. The madness of this galaxy would sooner or later get to them and try to kill them. Unbeknownst to them, many Zoats were wiped out by the Imperium of Man, or by orcs, or by other dangerous species in other parts of the galaxy, but they had no contact with those parts of their race. So this small fraction decided to create their own faction, try to grow in greater power in the name of protecting themselves. In many ways, the council was a giant scheme to protect their own skin. Not that different from the coalition, now is it? Ethereals created the United Authority to gather their own power and protect their own skill. Then they took over the Alliance and created coalition to do the same for themselves and the Tau. And the Zoats did something very similar for themselves, using faith and belief to create the council and expand their faith because they know potential of faith. They witnessed how depravity of Eldar created the Slanesh and brought end to their civilization. And Zoats, having quite deep comprehension of the psychic powers, knew that if they expand their faith to big enough scale, they have potential to fully form a deity in the warp which could challenge the Chaos Gods. In many ways, Zoats were planning to play the long game, As I said, I had a list of some species that I came up with, but I decided that they aren't really half as important as Zoads. You basically need only to know about Zoads, how I repurpose them, and how I tweak their history. Now they are an old one species of psychers and cyborgs who created their own faction based on faith in the name of creating, the warp deity to challenge chaos gods somewhere in the future. Dangerous game? Sure, but hell, it's a dangerous galaxy now, isn't it? Two factions, so similar yet so different to one another. And that was enough to start a Cold War. A Cold War which lasted exactly 55 years. As I said, the Council and the Coalition quickly became rivals. After all, they had a similar idea of uniting xenos and different factions within this region of space to create a bigger and stronger faction. The Council knew perfectly well that they were in bad situation. They were outnumbered and they had less worlds. So the Council moved very quickly to unify greater region of space. In fact, within those 55 years, they managed to gather 3 new members and gather 6 new worlds, which giving the Council a full number of 12 species under their command and 60 worlds. The Coalition in this time decided to basically stop their expansion and fully focus on preparing to plan out war with the Council to take it over. So they grew only 3 worlds, having now 180 under their command. So 3 times bigger than the Council. I must stress us out that both factions spent a lot of those 55 years to peacefully take over the other side. They used diplomacy, spies, and propaganda on quite great scale to peacefully convert the other faction. Basically, a lot of resources were directed, rather than to expansion in terms of colonies, to influence the other faction or build up their own power and wealth to convince people from the other faction to join them. And it was a stalemate. The Tau and, the Watercast and Zoads turned out to be extremely good diplomats, and they basically were cancelling each other out. So this Cold War, which started as a diplomatic Cold War, started to slowly transform into a more military one. Like in the second half, both sides were basically certain that only war would get them the win they hoped for. But their level of power wasn't exactly, similar. The coalition was significantly stronger, but their fleets were significantly slower. So that was another balancing act. the coalition had a need for far greater fleets and far greater military to both be able to attack and protect their borders. The council, on the other hand, had a need for also more powerful navy and powerful defenses to both be able to strike fast and deep thanks to their fleet that was using warp drives, but also to hold the line when the coalition was advancing on them. It was also a problem that their border was very close to the Broken Heart. And Broken Heart is the heart of anomalies of this region of space. This is the most dense region of anomalies, which influences this region of space, making navigation for both sides even more difficult. So even more time was spent trying to find out routes and ways to navigate space in this region to enable the invasion of the other side. It was a great game. The council had something like an equivalent of astropathic choirs, so they could communicate psychically on great distance, far faster than the coalition. And coalitions had still only the courier ships as the main way of communicating. So that, I hope, explains why this Cold War lasted 55 years. It was, similar to our Cold War. It was a conflict of ideologies and growing military on both sides, with hope to strike fast, hard, and take over the other side in one swift attack. And the coalition was fully prepared to go on all-out war. But again, the fact that the council had a significant number of worlds, still, even if a state like the council was only a third of the size of the coalition, they weren't weak. They had a lot of production, they had a lot of military races, they had significant and fast fleets, and thus themselves had significant population. There was also a problem of this ideology of both sides, that on the one hand they wanted to take over the other side, but they didn't want to do it by military. So it was also internal conflict within those factions that slowed the entire process down, that a full war never broke out. That all this time it was a Cold War. You can imagine the irritation of both sides. Both sides just exited the Golden Age, not long after a significant victory in a war, although the council was a bit younger than the coalition. So both the war that united them and the Golden Age was closer together in comparison to the coalition. They had similar ideas, similar plans, but they knew that they were holding each other out. And of course, there was a chance to expand, to colonize new worlds, sure, but moving resources to establish a new colony isn't a small task. And a start of every colony starts with deficit. And both sides weren't sure if this moment wouldn't be chosen by the other side to attack. So they were just holding each other in check for over a half a century. It wasn't as problematic Cold War as compared to our own, as they still traded a lot. I mean, trading trading really exploded in this age. Especially there were a lot of trade-focused factions within the council, and they were more than happy to trade with the coalition, and the same went to the coalition. They wanted to attempt to force the other side to be reliant on the technology of the other. This was stopped by the governments of both factions, so it was both a golden age of trade and the trade war at the same time. A giant mess. A giant mess, a time of contradictions upon a contradiction. It was really stressful for both sides because they didn't know what will happen next. I mean, they were very close to just go into an all-out war or hope to that other side would submit to the other. Or maybe that the ideas that they spread in each other factions would cause rebellion and disorder. Hell, there was a real possibility that a start of twin god or two-faced god rebellion within coalition would be just next to a rebellion of supporters of a greater good in the council. So it was even more chaotic and dangerous on this side. They wanted to take over the other side without losing the stability of their own faction. So they stood against each other, ready to strike, but not wanting to do so. It would seem that they would keep each other in check in this stalemate, in this age of stagnation in terms of expansion for a very long time. But that was not to be, for the greater galaxy couldn't care less about this petty Cold War. And as we all know, a Cold War is a terrible war, because no one is killing each other, there's no explosion, there's no death. They just stood there and looking at each other. And you know what? There is a faction in 40k that knows how to have a good war, how to have fun in war, how to showcase how good Daka and good Choppa can make war oh so brilliant. Oh yes, the green tide was coming. Ah, the orcs. They're big, they're mean, and they're going to beat your ass. Honestly, it's hard to not like orcs. Although, I personally have a little strange take on them. I hope you will listen to it. I feel sorry for orcs in a certain way. And I know it might sound strange, after all, the orcs are a faction, a race, which wouldn't have a 40k galaxy in any other way. There's war, there's death, there's destruction, there are so many things to kill. To chop with a chopper, to shoot with a daka, it's a heaven for orcs. But I look at them and think, hell, not only how mighty have fallen, but they are a rogue bioweapon. Before the old ones transform them into this weapon of mass destruction, they could have been anything. And in the War in Heaven, they were the greatest warriors, most likely this galaxy ever seen. I mean, the Krogs could most likely crush the Imperium of Man, the in the humanity during the dark age of technology and the Tyranids at the same time. I mean, I know that some people say that, oh, the Eldar are the reason why the Necrons went to sleep. But the Eldar always struck me as a psychic threat, a threat more directed to counter the Catan. The Krogs are a perfect enemy against Necrons, because Necrons, there are a shit ton of them, and they reanimate. And Orcs reproduce by dying and spreading spores. I mean, they're perfect counter to the Necrons. Hell, the Imhotep, the Stormlord, despises the Orcs because he can't figure them out. Ever since the War in Heaven, the greatest Necron commander, the greatest general of that age and race, just can't figure out the Orcs, or Krogs, as they were known in the past. And I feel a bit sad because if the old ones made Orcs a little bit different, they could create the greatest warrior civilization known to the 40k galaxy. And now look at them. How mighty have fallen, to what they were reduced. From the greatest warriors who beat the Necrons, who forced them to sleep, who... Just think about it. The Necrons managed to enslave their gods. They technically won the war in heaven. They defeated their Pantheon. And the Krogs are one of the main reasons why they decided to go to sleep, to fuck off, and don't mess with them or the Eldar. Not a small thing, in my opinion. And now they are just reduced to this. It's a bit sad from my perspective. I know that the Orcs don't care about it, but hell, the Krogs sound impressive. The Orcs are just a shadow. Great warriors reduced to basically animals. It's grim reality. Quite fitting for grim darkness of 40k galaxy, isn't it? Sorry, I'm mumbling again. I hope you will forgive me. Sometimes I just want to share my thoughts here and there. So, the Green Tide that managed to break apart the stupid Cold War between the Council and the Coalition started with the Head Smasher Great Captain Wag. This Wag didn't originate within this sphere of warp storms that was isolating this region of space from the rest of the galaxy. Quite the opposite. That region of space was basically free of Orcs, to the surprise of everyone. So, this Wa originated from outside of this sphere of warp storms. And you might ask, well, okay, but where they were going, or did they just smashed into this sphere of warp storms for fun? No. Originally, this Wa was gunning for Ultramar. You know, to have a good fight, a good war with lucky blue boys. The Ultramarines, of course, notice it, called for help from successor chapters. They faced the Orcs and beat the ever-loving shit out of them. Around 150 M39. They basically broke the Wa apart and forced it to scatter. the biggest fraction of this war, under the command of Head Smasher Great Captain, gunned for this great sphere of warp storms and crashed into it. And then disappeared, because crashing into a warp storm usually isn't healthy. And Imperial Command, Ultramarine said, okay, good war, we just beat the ever-loving shit of orcs, we either massacred them or scattered their fleet, and a significant chunk of their forces, which we would probably had to deal with, just smashed into a giant warp storm just next door and got eaten by it. Holy shit, how good that is. I mean, how many people, how many lives were saved because those damn orcs get themselves killed going for that warp storm. Well, from perspective of the Imperium, yeah, those orcs were gone, no longer a problem. Problem is, a portion of this war gunned for this sphere of warp storms, managed to pass through. Either Gork or Mork, or maybe both, decided that it would be fun to introduce the races of the Coalition and the Council to the best color, which is green. We all know that the green is the greatest color, but the Council and the Coalition didn't, and they had to be informed. In fact, the blessing of Gork or Mork, or both, is quite visible in this region of space, because the place which was pierced by the orc fleets left few anomalies that to this day are known as Beast's Teeth, for obvious reason. The remains of this war exited the warp within this sphere, not that far from borders of both Coalition and the Council, and decided to turn this Cold War into Hot War by just crashing into both factions and introducing them to the concept of green is better. A war which would last for almost 100 years. For many ages, it would be known as the greatest, the bloodiest, and the longest war the Coalition experienced. In 167 M39, or 3,999 years of Age of Unity, the Cold War between the Coalition and the Council came to an end. The Third Coalition War was only about to begin. So yeah, I believe that's it for today. A significantly shorter episode than the last one. As I said, I tried to keep things cohesive, and the ending of the Cold War between the Council and the Coalition, as well as the start of a Third Coalition War, the first war with another major faction of 40k Galaxy, is a good place to end this episode. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I again apologize to Marxismo for mispronouncing his name. I hope this time I said it a little bit better than last time. If not, please scold me in the comments, but unless I will be using one of your races again, I don't think I will address it once again. But that's beside the point. I hope you enjoy my idea of recycling zealots into something more useful and hopefully more interesting. And I hope you are ready for the first real war with real major faction of 40k the Tau and the Coalition at large ever experienced. But that is a story for another time. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this little episode. Now, my dear listeners, remember, wherever you are, whatever you do, try to enjoy yourself while you can. I wish you most heretical day. Ta-ta!